I know a good number of you in the room. I don't know everyone here. I'm Jeff Koller. I'm a member here at Eden. And I was asked to present on this topic. And I realized after I said, yeah, I can do that, that it's a minefield. And I'm warn you all to be everyone here will probably leave disappointed, because there's no way to approach this topic. If I start lifting out names and highlight this person, you'll say, why didn't you talk about my grandpa or my dad or whatever? So prepare to be unhappy with me when you leave. But approaching the topic, I toyed with different angles, and angles of lifting up people who have had a tremendous influence on the world, on the community, and highlight those stories. But that's where you get in trouble. So I came back around, and I picked 5 stories that I want to share, and they are people who influenced the world in a different way, but backing it up to an Anabaptist Schweitzer position. And I'm separating Schweitzer and Anabaptist just a little bit in that. So my one chair taken here, but those are over here. My alternate title is How Has One Unique Group of Anabaptist Believers Lived Out Their Faith? And what are the implications and what are the influences that's had on people? How do Anabaptists with a Schweitzer heritage influence the world around them? And then I thought about what characteristics make Schweitzers somewhat unique. We're not the only folks, but a common thread. The Schweitzer people from 150 years ago and coming forward have been deeply, deeply committed to their faith, to the Anabaptist faith, and unwavering. And a couple of stories I'll share will show that the unwavering faith will not compromise. And then I used a naughty word, stubborn. That none of you can name any family members who are stubborn, most likely. But one piece that's a little more unique is the tightness of the community and a somewhat survival mentality. That was very true up until our parents' generation still saved that because of the draft, because of other outside influences attacking or coming after the church. They knew that we had to stay tight, stay close, stay committed to the same common cause. Still im Lande. Be quiet. Don't stir. Don't cause trouble. Don't be obvious. Keep your head down. Stay out of trouble. Stay in tight community. That is a strong Schweitzer characteristic, and common, I think, to most of the community. Our generation has drifted much further away. There's been less pressure. I don't know what our children's generation will be like as they reach this age, where that tight community, if that will continue to exist. But what drove the people I want to share about is that sense of tight community. And the other thing I found in going through these stories and doing the research, the circular nature of these stories, how they keep coming around, and confluences, connections, influences within the stories, how they touch people. So I threw bookmarks in every now and then to come back to, oh, you remember when I was talking about this person and their experience, look how it connected over here to this person. That relates back still to somewhat to that tight community, to that Schweitzer persona, if that's fair to say. So rather than pick individuals to talk about, I picked 4 topics where Schweitzers have had influence in the world: education, service, peacemaking, and in healthcare, and specifically mental health care. And you'll probably know where I'm going with that. But those are the topics I went to, that I researched, and I found stories to feed into that. So first ones I want to talk about, tell a couple of stories. Jay Gehring, E.G. Kaufman, and Gordon. And I realized yesterday, that all the people on my list could be called ancestors except Jay. Jay doesn't get to be an ancestor quite yet, but he is the only living example. Jay Gehring was not born in Mound Ridge. He's born in Michigan, while his parents were serving in CPS at Ypsilanti. And coming from that birth in the service field, coming home to the church community, and the immersion in Schweitzer heritage was very, very formative to Jay and the positions he took. He was drafted at age 18, like most were in the 60s, but he went to Bethel and stayed there for 3 years. And then he entered MCC service. As his form of alternative service, he opted for MCC, and he was assigned to go to Africa. And he was in Kenya. Jay taught school at the Kajabi school in Kenya. And one of the things that he shared with me, it's kind of funny, when he came in, he was teaching sciences. In the British proper system of education, which is what was imposed on Kenya when it was a British colony, they don't have grades, they have forms, and when you finish a form, there's testing. And the year Jay arrived was the year there was to be testing to progress to the next form. And the students there were very, very afraid, and they openly told him, we don't know if we want you or like you or whatever, because he was a first-year teacher, and they figured he didn't know what he's doing, and they're going to fail their forms and have to repeat. So Jay had a mark on him when he got there. And as it turned out, 100% passed, and he became a hero in the school. But he was an unqualified teacher when he got there. The significant thing is, and what I take from his experience, Jay worked with and related to, I took my notes from, I talked to him earlier, and he called me just Thursday, to correct himself. I originally wrote he related to more than 200 students per year, so after 5.5 years, he influenced more than 1,000 young people. He said he redid the math and looked back at his records. He actually worked with 400 students per year, so more than a couple thousand young people were influenced because Jay Gehring, of Schweitzer heritage, you don't serve in the military, strong will, strong and unwavering will, chose alternative service, and then touched the lives of a couple of thousand students. One of those students you will know is John Muthama. In Jay's first year there, he was so impressed by John and his work ethic and his brilliant mind that he felt John needed some more education, more support, because John was never going to progress beyond finishing high school. Finances and poverty, there was no chance. So Jay connected back to church. A half a dozen families in the Eden congregation raised the money to sponsor John, bring him to Bethel College, and you all know about the running records and everything else that he set. But John then, with a college degree in education, went back to Kajabi, took a job at his school, and served there for almost 50 years, 45, 47 years, as a teacher, as a principal and superintendent of schools. Strong leadership. John then, if you think about 40, 45 years of student contact, how many tens of thousands of people were influenced? If you back that up to one CO from Mound Ridge, Kansas, that did that. That's what I think of Schweitzer influence on the world and going out. We had the privilege last October of visiting with John and Ruth. We spent 3 weeks in Kenya, and John and Ruth traveled with us around as we visited around the country. John, sidelight on his running records here. I asked him about his mentality with running and his what motivated him. He said, I really didn't try to set all those records. That just happened. He said, all I did was try to be faster than the guy behind me. He said, I never did run my full potential. I just beat the guy behind me. I appreciated that. The circular piece of this is now that John's daughter Anne, who has a business degree, has been called and feels strongly led to go into social work because of the needs that she sees in the community. And she's wanting to go back to school and get a social work degree. She's applied to and been accepted at Bethel, and Jay is leading a group of folks working to get some finances arranged so that Ann can come back to Bethel. So a second generation Muthama coming. And I just love the way this circles around and comes back to one CO that chose that service. The second person I researched, and I'm glad Mr. Yonke is here, Jim is here. Your book did a lot of good for me. E.G. Kaufman, Edmund G. Kaufman properly, but E.G. to this community and most anybody that knew him. I owe a lot to Kirsten Zerger, who sat with me for an interview and gave me a lot more information regarding her grandpa. He was Bethel College president beginning in 1932 and served that role for 20 years. But it was a very, very challenging choice at the time. He was being encouraged to lead the Whitmarsham Seminary at Bluffton. And this was compounded by a variety of other influences. The U.S. was emerging from the Great Depression, and and finances were hard. Bethel College was in trouble, and so was the seminary. And so choosing which route for him to go was challenging. To compound it worse, there was a controversy here in central Kansas. There were differing voices calling for differing approaches to education of Anabaptist young people. E.G. chose Bethel after a long period of discernment. Bethel was struggling mightily with red ink, and E.G. agreed to take the job 9 days after a highly contentious meeting was held with over 800 people in attendance. The issue was whether Bethel should be a Bible college, like Grace College of the Bible in Omaha, or a liberal arts school with a heavy Bible program attached. This was the challenge and the conflict in the meeting. The vote at that meeting was won by 9 votes out of 800 people to favor a liberal arts college, which it became. And one of the things that Jim recorded in the book here, H.P. Crable, who some of you probably know about Henry Peter Crable. He was born at Summerfield, Illinois in 1862, third child of Christian and Susanna Ruth Crable. He had 3 living sisters and 8 brothers, of whom 3 preceded him in death. His parents immigrated from the Palatinate. In 1878, he and his brother J.W. Crable went to Kansas to break prairie for the coming of the Christian Crable family to Kansas. So at age 18, Henry came here. Well, Henry then became ultimately the editor and publisher of Mennonite Weekly Review and Herald Press, and that was he was a very prominent role in the Newton community. The meeting was held to discuss which way the college should go, what the direction that the college would be, and this excerpt, even H.P. Crable was willing to withhold judgment. Oh, this is after E.G. took the job. H.P. sat on the fence to see how this young whippersnapper is going to do at this role. So it said even H.P. Crable was willing to withhold judgment for a time. Ed made an appointment to meet with Crable and found him belligerent, still smarting from his defeat at the April conference. H.P. was in favor of the Grace Bible model rather than the liberal arts, and didn't get his way. In this meeting, Crable said, "I can make you or break you, young man." Kaufman said, "I broke Cleaver." I broke Crable. Crable made no such promises at the first meeting, but at the fall meeting of the Western District Conference that same year, he was so impressed with Kaufman's presentation of Bethel's situation that he made a dramatic endorsement of Kaufman's decisive leadership to that point. Ed later told ex-President Cleaver, "Now I know that Crable was sick and tired of constantly fighting. He wants to get on the water wagon too." Imagine stepping into that role at barely 40 years old a massive uphill climb before you. As I read that and contemplated that and visited with Kirsten, all the adjectives that I used before come into play. Unwavering, committed, stubborn. E.G. Schweitzer upbringing prepared him for the role. The influences of his birth culture shaped the man who would go on to shape the college and set it on the course that would help propel it to become the school that it is today. Some of the things that he had to do because of finances. He changed he reworked the budget and came up with a limit of $24,000 for teacher salaries. Now, this is 32. $24,000 for all salaries, which meant everyone on staff took a cut in pay. He was hired at a salary of $2,500, which he cut himself to $1,600. So he suffered with the folks. But imagine being there and taking a cut in pay, and then to compound it, the North Central Association of Colleges was trying to do accreditation and get these KCAC type schools in line with that accreditation, and Bethel fell far short. Only 2 of the department heads had PhDs, so we were undereducated at that time. E.G. also then says, for the faculty, the plan required progress toward graduate degrees, and in isolated cases, replacement of weak teachers with stronger ones. At first, Kaufman threatened to clean house with a very large broom. In the late 1932, the month he accepted the presidency, Cornelius C. Weedle, chairman of the board of directors, sent a letter to all faculty that as soon as possible, Bethel's 10 regular liberal arts departments must be headed by persons with PhD degree, along with outstanding teaching, attractive personality, devotion to Mennonite principles, and a Christ-centered life. That's what you had to do to hold your job. All but 2 department heads lacked the PhD. Weedle's letter said that faculty would allow leave of absence at once to work on degrees, but the administration would be free to replace those not qualifying after the 32-33 school year. Exceptions would be possible under extraordinary circumstances. Bottom line is, all 10 had PhDs in 2 years under AG's promotion, leadership. So my question, to fit the topic, he answered the question, how did one Schweitzer young man influence the world? If you look at the Bethel College and what it became rather than what it was headed toward, and we can't guess what had it become a Bible college, what that future might have been. It may have been just as robust, we don't know. But he set a strong direction and shaped the college at a time when it was really, really struggling and on the brink of bankruptcy. So I think pretty strong influence. E.G. was the father of Gordon Kaufman, and Gordon followed his father into higher education. Gordon held degrees from Bethel, Northwestern, and 2 divinity degrees from Yale. Gordon went on to teach at Harvard Divinity School for more than 30 years. And a personal story there, I was with Mennonite Disaster Service in Colorado after the flooding west of Boulder in 2013, I guess it was. As MDS comes in, we look for a place to house our volunteers, and there was this one large, nice house in town that was available. I talked to the owner. It was a woman named Dr. Deborah Haynes. We negotiated and talked about the use of her house. She agreed to let us use it. And I said, before we go much further, I should explain to you somewhat about Mennonite Disaster Service and who the Mennonites are that would be here, so you have a clear understanding, so we're no surprises later. And she said, oh, you don't need to tell me about Mennonites. And I said, oh, really? And she said, I taught Anabaptist theology for 20-some years at Harvard Divinity School. I said, you did? And she said, yeah. And I said, so I said, so you know Gordon, or you knew Gordon? And she looked, and she did a double. You knew Gordon? And we shared that in common. She ended up being the one who preached at Gordon's funeral. They were very, very close colleagues. The last piece I'm taking out of Jim Youngke's book is Letting Go. To the end, E.G. yearned for China and for the classroom. He did mission work in China as well as the Bethel College. In 1971, at 79 years of age, he applied to the General Conference Commission Overseas Mission for a seminary teaching position in Taiwan. He was 14 years past retirement age, and the mission's response had to be negative, although the letter thanked Ed for the courage you have displayed in making this offer. In early 1980, Kaufman was 88 years old, weakened by several mild strokes, prepared to die. He had long urged his son Gordon to come visit, but Gordon's schedule at Harvard had been very busy. On February 7, Gordon finally made the trip from Massachusetts to Kansas together with his son, Ed's grandson and namesake, Edmund George Kaufman II, who was approaching his 18th birthday. Ed, Gordon, Edna, and Edmund, too, talked over many things late into the evening. That night in bed, Ed Kaufman had his final stroke. It was as if he had been waiting for the last intergenerational conversation. He could then release himself to eternity. He was happy, wrote Edna to the family after a funeral at the Bethel College Mennonite Church, to start a new journey in his spiritual life. Strong commitment, strong values, and strong influences. Before I leave here, a side note that I kept tripping over in doing the research is Ed was a close friend and close confidant of Erland Waltner. And many of you would know Erland Waltner as he was at Mennonite Biblical Seminary, AMBS president, 1950 from 56 to 62 president of the General Conference, 1962 to 72 president of Mennonite World Conference, and he also was connected to the Whit-Marson Seminary. When E.G. declined that job, Erland, another Schweitzer from the Freeman community, stepped in, and those two were dancing between Bethel and seminary, and that's how it landed. So two Schweitzer boys ended up in on that same discussion. Wish the air conditioner worked better. Moving to the topic of service, Mennonite disaster service, which any of these topics by any of these individuals could be an hour's presentation on their own. Jim's book is so rich on E.G. That's worth an hour. But MDS is widely recognized among Mennonites as well as dozens of other faith communities as a standard by which other service agencies can be measured. MDS affords believers the opportunity to live out their beliefs in tangible ways. While MDS was not created by Schweitzers, it was very heavily influenced by Schweitzers in its infancy and throughout its 75 years of existence. Mennonite Disaster Service was created by a discussion among the members of the Pennsylvania Mennonite Church, Heston, which later became Whitestone Mennonite Church. This Sunday school class gathered for a picnic in Athletic Park in Newton on July 28, 1950. The class was composed of young families who had all served in CPS during World War II. They were all deeply affected by performing public service and felt called to continued service for a couple of reasons. One, service to others is biblical, and specifically by the Sermon on the Mount. Number two, service would help demonstrate to the larger community that CO Mennonites are good citizens and willing to serve larger society. Soon after this gathering and discussion, Mother Nature provided the opportunity, several times in short order. When flooding occurred in Wichita soon after the then Mennonite Service Organization, the first several years was MSO, not MDS, the Mennonite Service Organization was developed. They responded with groups of men to go do sandbagging along the river. The first several days they were able to send 10 to 15 men per day, but the need was overwhelming. So John Diller, who was the coordinator, reached out to his friends at Eden Mennonite Church. The very next day, Eden sent 35 men to support the effort. In the following days, upwards of 50 men per day from Eden responded. This pattern continued with Eden and the Mound Ridge community, supporting the Pennsylvania Mennonite and Heston Mennonite Church, which had joined in with Pennsylvania Mennonite by that time, who joined the effort. Woo. Yeah, within weeks following the Wichita flooding, more than half of Salina, Kansas, a city of 26,000 people, was flooded. MSO helped evacuate people from homes and institutions. At 7 p.m., the need for cots and blankets for people driven out of their homes was communicated to MSO. The response was swift and generous. MSO, the entire communities of Heston and Mound Ridge participated. Within 2 hours, 176 cots and 300 blankets were delivered to Salina. Could we do that today? Pretty amazing. It was during this time in the early 50s that Eden had a pastor named Peter Dick. Peter came to Eden after leading relief work with Mennonite Central Committee for the previous 10 years. What he saw in the emerging MSO spoke to him, and he recognized the potential for this new service arm of the church. Peter lent his strong organizational skills to the organization and was named its first chairperson, and worked alongside other strong leaders like Lyle Yost and Harold Dick. MSO grew to include a wider network of churches, and eventually Peter shepherded them to become an arm of Mennonite Central Committee. Note, when Peter concluded as pastor at Eden, he returned to MCC leadership in Africa and Europe before becoming the administrator of MCC headquarters in Akron, Pennsylvania. Over the years, the Kansas unit of MDS, the South Dakota unit, and the MDS Region 3 Leadership Board have had constant presence in the Schweitzer communities. Schweitzers have served on the National Board of Directors. Tim Schrog is currently serving on both the regional and national level. When you consider that MDS mobilizes now over 7,000 volunteers per year across the spectrum of Anabaptist churches, and this has been going on for 75 years, repairing and rebuilding homes for thousands and thousands and thousands of disaster survivors, it's especially touching to realize that its infancy was supported by Schweitzers. And again, a circular story. E.G. to Gordon to Deborah Haynes, back around to MDS. I love the strings that kept coming through. The next area I looked at was Peace Witness and the story of Gerhard Stucke. As I researched for the presentation, it's very clear that the Anabaptist faith, as lived out by the Schweitzer community, has influenced many aspects of life. I don't know that it's appropriate to elevate any one example over the other, but as you've seen already, the steadfast, committed faith demonstrated by our ancestors are far-reaching, affecting thousands of people outside our small communities. Saying that, I'm always drawn in a special way to the story of Gerhard Stucke and the impact that a life of a young farm boy cut short has had. Way, way, way back in time, in 1975, I think it was, my wife Becky and I were youth sponsors and newlyweds, and we were youth sponsors here at Eden, working closely with Pastor Walt Neufeld, and he would call me Walt, not Pastor Walt. We were making special efforts to teach about the peace position and peace witness of the Anabaptist faith to our young people. We loaded up a bus full, about 25 to 30 young people, along with 3 World War I COs, and made the trip to Camp Funston up near Fort Riley. H.A. Fast, Dr. Faust, Ernest Bachman, and Henry Gehring went with us and told stories of their times there. Dr. Fast specifically talked about the Gerhard Stucki story and related that when he, Dr. Fast, joined the delegation to Washington, D.C. to lobby for Selective Service, the Selective Service Act, the stories of martyrdom, Gerhard and the two Hofer boys from South Dakota, were a very significant turning point in the enactment of alternative service options. Dr. Fast's position was this, quite simply: we Anabaptists are committed. We will not bend. We will not take up arms for the war efforts. The U.S. will have the blood of its own citizens on its hands if the status quo is allowed to go on. I fast forwarded. Do you all know the Gerhard Stucki story? I'm using him as an example. I'm seeing shaking heads. Gerhard was a young man from this community, drafted World War I, went up. He absolutely refused the uniform. He refused any compliance with orders whatsoever. We learned from Ernie Bachman and Henry Gehring and others that level of compliance made a difference. My grandfather was one who was there, and each one took a different role at Funston. If you refused everything, you were basically jailed. You were held separate, and then you were tortured. Gerhard Zerger, in his story, and it's recorded the Bethel archives, Gerhard Zerger's story, he was older. He traveled up there to visit our boys at camp, and he witnessed Gerhard Stucki in a pit in the ground with two fence posts on either side, with his arms suspended in February in bitter cold weather, with only his underwear on, and they were throwing buckets of cold water on him, trying to break him to make him become a soldier. The torture that went on there was horrendous, and Gerhard lost his life. The influenza, man, we just came out of COVID. I can't think of the word.
Spanish flu.
Yeah, Spanish flu, but
Pandemic.
pandemic. Thank you. I couldn't get the word. Yeah, the flu pandemic came through at the same time while he's out there being subjected to those kind of conditions, and Gerhard lost his life. And one of the saddest parts was when they returned his body back here to Mound Ridge. It was in a coffin, dressed in a full military uniform, with a flag draped over the coffin as a veteran.
Oh, no.
And I spoke with Gerhard's niece, who remembered her mother crying whenever the thought came up, crying for endlessly about the shame, because back then you didn't mess with the body, you had to bury it. So her son buried in the Hopefield Cemetery in a military uniform, in disgracing the family and the church and you know the implications of that. So I can't imagine the trauma that was experienced there. I do know that one of the other people we invited to come along was Jacob Gehring, Terrence's grandfather. He was at Memorial Home and still very active in getting around. Jake wouldn't go, and as I was interviewing him and talking with him, he was in tears. He said, I can never return to that place, and I can never tell the stories of what I saw. It was too brutal. And Terrence will affirm that the Vic, Terrence's dad Vic, Jake's son Vic, never did learn what his dad saw and experienced there. So, to Dr. Fast's point, we Anabaptists are committed. We will not bend. We will not take up arms. You will have the blood of your own citizens on your hands. Schweitzer boys raised up in a committed community can change the world. How many thousands of young COs owe the privilege of alternative service to the Gerhard Stuckis and the influence of Schweitzers? The last area to cover is mental health care, and for here I went to the story of Ed Schrog. Edwin Schrog, Tim's dad, a member of this church. Eddie served, and he went by Eddie. It was okay to call him Eddie. Served in several CPS camps, Denison, Iowa, North Fork, California, and finally Poughkeepsie, New York. Ed got his draft notice in a really interesting way. He was on a Bethel College choir tour in Indiana, and someone came up to him with a telegram that they had received, and it was to locate Edwin J. Schrog and give him his notice to report. And Ed had to go directly to the train station, leave the choir tour, go to the train station, come to Kansas. Was home 24 hours, was on a train back up to Fort Riley for his induction. And then through the CO process, he took the CO process and went to civilian public service, thanks to Gerhard and Dr. Fast and others. Fast forward through all of Eddie's experience to Poughkeepsie. Eddie was teamed up with Ralph Lehman, and they worked in the Hudson River State Mental Hospital. They were assigned to do insulin therapy initially, and that was soon followed by electroshock therapy. Both therapies cruel, crude, and clearly not aimed at healing. This is mental health we're talking about. It was controversial. They're experimenting with human guinea pigs, is the bottom line. Eddie and Ralph witnessed the death of patients who were overdosed with insulin. Eddie witnessed many instances of patient abuse, the beating of patients, broken bones, etc. Eddie and Ralph reported those abuses to the CPS camp director, Bert Schmucker. Unbeknownst to them, Bert had been reporting upstream to Dr. John Ross, the director of the hospital and also a state health authority. Assisting Dr. Ross was a woman named Edna Ramsar. Eddie spoke highly of her and her influence at the hospital. Edna was to become Mrs. E.G. Kaufman. So another thread, another circle, coming back around. Small world. Their account, this is from the book I did a collection a number of years ago, and their story is in here. We four CPS men, so it's Eddie, Ralph, and a couple of others, sharing our revulsion of this sadistic treatment of Sam and the all too numerous episodes of other patient abuse, made the decision to force the issue. We would present our threats to refuse to work further on this ward until action is taken to put an end to this abuse. We even talked about going AWOL, or over the hill, walking out of CPS. We reported this latest episode to our unit leader, Bert, who set up an appointment with Dr. Ross. My memory of our encounter with Dr. Ross is somewhat hazy, but I recall his listening to our account of what we witnessed. He asked a few questions, encouraged us to unload, and with forceful declaration, he told us to say nothing of this to anyone except Bert Schmucker. Go back to our normal duties on the ward and remember with great detail everything we see which we consider to be abuse. Then we were to return to our living quarters. We were to write down with great detail the patient's names, attendants' names, time and duration of each incident, and a detailed description of just what had just happened. We were to share with no one and daily hand our journal accounts in to Bert. We were to do this for a given period of time, 2 months, but I can't recall exactly how long we did it. The next day, fast forwarding here, next day large headlines appeared in the Poughkeepsie newspaper about the dismissal of attendants and the involvement of the CPS men in reporting patient abuse, precipitating Dr. Ross's dismissal action. I do remember several occasions we had to give depositions to tell our story and respond to questions. I believe the attorneys for Dr. Ross and the State Department of Mental Health protected us from any serious harassments at these depositions. My memory seems to be mostly the criticism in the newspaper, where it was reported that as pacifists, we were not reliable witnesses to patient abuse, since we were ill-prepared to distinguish normal patient care from abuse. We were accused of labeling as patient abuse the routine and normal handling of some patients. While Ed and other folks were experiencing this in Poughkeepsie at the hospital there, it was happening all across America. Schweitzer CPSers were assigned to several of these hospitals: Ypsilanti, Michigan, birthplace of Jay Gehring, and Norristown Hospital in Pennsylvania were a couple of examples. The influence this ended up having was pretty incredible. This is from a book, If We Can Love, the Mennonite Mental Health Story. Thank you, Paul Unruh, formerly of Prairie View, who lent me this copy. Eventually, more than 3,000 COs who worked for 2 to 4 years in the hospital in 22 states shared their observations with the public to help effect some reforms. Frank Wright, the author of Out of Sight, Out of Mind, claims that COs amassed the greatest wealth of factual material about conditions in mental hospitals that has ever been gathered in one place. Based on the documentary evidence gathered over 4 years by CPS men, the May 6, 1946 issue of Life magazine exposed the deplorable state of affairs in an article titled Bedlam, 1946, Most U.S. Mental Hospitals Are a Shame and Disgrace. And it goes on. Another illustration of how CPS men influenced practices in state hospitals came from the Lima, Ohio Institution for the Criminally Insane. All the inmates had criminal records. It had been the practice of all attendants to carry blackjacks, clubs, lead-weighted clubs, for protection. But when the unit of CPS men came, they asked to go into the wards without clubs. Permission was granted with the warning that it was a dangerous action. It worked out so well, however, that the practice of carrying blackjacks was abandoned for all employees, and a new and different patient and attendant attitude was created. So these CPSers, these dumb Mennonite farm boys that don't know anything about mental health, had somewhat an effect. This was happening nationally at a legal level. And then another excerpt here. Parallel to the above developments were discussions by young men in the Mennonite CPS hospital units eventually led to the establishment of Mennonite mental health hospitals in the United States. An excellent collection of such discussions is brought together by Robert Kreider, Educational Secretary of the Mennonite Central Committee CPS units. A symposium, should the churches establish and maintain hospitals for the mentally ill. Paul Gehring, a CPS hospital leader, also referred to the precedents of the Quakers, citing the advantages of such hospital terms in spirit of love, removing corruption, and a higher caliber of attendant help. Eugene Weed, a non-Mennonite CPS man, viewed Mennonites with their strong heritage of wholesome living as being able to provide the basics for good care, but also to offer something central around which to reorganize life. Loris Habegger, another CPS leader, urged consideration of psychiatric wings in general hospitals. So it's no small amount of influence that the Schweitzers and the CPS men had in the mental health industry. I don't know if without these reports and the hundreds or was it thousands of CPSers that ended up doing that, what if the mental health system would be what it is today? If the state had continued to run it with, you heard the state attitudes toward it, pretty remarkable. In the same book on mental health, there's a story from a man named Richard C. Hunter, a Mental Health Association executive. And he himself went to serve in CPS. He said, although Camp 5 was totally Mennonite until our contingent of non-Mennonites arrived from the Twin Cities in Minnesota, it was some time before I realized I was an outsider. And then it wasn't because I was excluded or treated in some special fashion. There was no discrimination, and as far as I know, the non-Mennonites were treated fairly. Probably the most conspicuous difference, at least so far as I was concerned, was stemming from urban versus rural cultures. Even these differences did not make barriers. On the afternoon of the first day in camp, this city dweller, speaking of himself, this city dweller, office worker, found himself in fresh, brand new work clothes, digging a diversion ditch to prevent erosion. As I recall, it was Jake Hofer, accustomed to hard labor, who worked silently beside me. After a period of observation, he reached without a word to take my heavier shovel and replace it with his, which proved to be much more manageable. It was an experience such as this that helped me gradually accept that the role of outsider when I finally realized that that's what I was. So I ended up with a conundrum. The early slide talked about deeply committed, unwavering, stubborn, tight community, and survival. Are we a tight community? Is that a good thing or not? It's what sustained the Schweitzer tradition. There are a lot of positives to that closed community, but there are also a lot of negatives. It really is a conundrum to me. Which way do we lean? What's the Schweitzer? What should be our direction? There's a really telling, a really nicely worded paragraph at the tail end of the book. As I conclude, I have a concern that those of Mennonite heritage, with their defenses down, may become so blended in with all the others that there will cease to be an inside and outside. There will be no outsiders. He has a concern that there will be no outsiders. Boundaries need not be barriers, but they can and should define a unique people who need, for the benefit of the rest of us, to preserve their uniqueness, not to stand against the forces of the outside world, but to inspire those on the outside to something higher than they would otherwise know. I like that. I like that thought as a way forward. I don't know what the way forward is, but how do you sustain community but turn it into a positive, to be a positive influence on the world going out? It's a great challenge.
One of the characteristics I learned about on your characteristic was you can always tell a Schweitzer, but you can't tell him much.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.